Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to the inaugural launch of the InspirASIAN series from the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, or the ACE Center. The title of this panel is called Research and Reflections on South Asia, Presentations on Caste, the Hindu Goddess Kali, and Ecological Literacy. Oh, I think I've changed that. Sorry, Dr. Baniya, you can let other people know. Before we begin, I would first like to recite the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Tutelo and Monacan people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech consumes. We pay respect to the Tutelo and Monacan nations and to their elders past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge the university's historical ties to the indentured and enslaved whose labors built this institution. We pay respect to these people for their contributions to Virginia Tech. Next, I would like to introduce our presenters in the order of their presentations. Our first presenter is Dr. Sweta Baniya, who is an assistant professor of rhetoric and professional and technical writing in the Department of English. Dr. Baniya's presentation is entitled Managing Environmental Risks in the Age of Climate Change, Rhetorical Agency and Ecological Literacies of Transnational Women during the April 2015 Nepal earthquake. Our second presenter is Dr. Bonnie Zare, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology. Dr. Zare's presentation is entitled, We Are Working for a Caste-Free India, the words of activist author M.M. Vinodini. I hope that's right. And finally, our last presenter is Dr. Suchitra Samanta, who is a collegiate associate professor in women's and gender studies in the Department of Sociology. Dr. Samanta's presentation is entitled Research and Subjective Motivation, My Projects on Bengali Religious Experience and on Muslim Female Literacy in Kolkata, India. Thank you very much for being here. And why don't we get started?
Should I start sharing my screen?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much for inviting me today and allowing me a chance to present my work. So the title of my presentation is Managing Environmental Risk in the Age of Climate Change, Rhetorical Agency and Ecological Literacies of Transnational Women during the April 2015 Nepal earthquake. So at noon on April 25, 2015, when the earthquake hit, I was with my friend at a conference in the heart of Kathmandu city. And I asked her, is this an earthquake? And she replied, no. But all the people in the room had already started to scream, exit the building that was shaking, and so we exited as well. With my trembling body and a shocked mind, I checked the Twitter on my phone to find out that it was the biggest disaster of the century. Within few minutes, pictures, news, facts, and information were shared worldwide with the announcement of 7.5 magnitude earthquake that struck Nepal. And more than 8,000 people had died in 14 districts and around 26,000 injured. And it created a big humanitarian crisis in Nepal with 7 billion worth of loss. Meanwhile, the crisis also added nuances to disaster response by creating global concerns, both in online and offline spaces that help facilitate transnational disaster response. At the time, I work as a journalist as well as a communication officer in a nonprofit, as well as my own online presence on Twitter, allowed me to participate in the transnational disaster response. So in this presentation, I am specifically going to talk about how Nepali women helped manage a disaster during the Nepal earthquake. So my major research question for this particular presentation is how Nepal women were able to exercise transnational rhetorical agency as well as ecological literacies through disaster response. So I came up with this question because a lot of times the struggle of women and their vulnerability is represented And this question also comes amid a time where women and girls are represented as vulnerable citizens, especially during the earthquake. And a lot of times that's true as well, because a lot of women and girls lost their lives because they were inside their homes doing their household chores. And Nepali women, and that includes myself as well, are often considered as being vulnerable, needing of protection without agency. However, the female participants of my project shared an alternative narrative of agency as well as social action. So, amid the vulnerability rhetoric about women, I argue that studying this situation via alternative narratives of women can illuminate the kinds of future response that will be needed in the wake of climate change and future disasters. So I will keep on using this word transnational women in this presentation. So I'm regarding women participants as transnational women in my context, in the context of my research, and I regard them as those who have created a connection beyond their nationality, established networks, both personal and professional, beyond their geographical locations, and have engaged locally as well as globally with the use of digital media. So this is a part of a larger project, which was a mixed method study where I did quantitative data collection and conducted social network analysis of around like 50 million tweets from Nepal and Puerto Rico. And again, for qualitative, I collected a lot of narratives from both Nepal and Puerto Rico. But again, like in this presentation, to make it more simple, I'm just concentrating it on Nepali women and their role. Um, So I conducted narrative inquiry, which allowed my participants and me to have a common space, breaking down the dichotomies between participant as well as researcher, as we focus on having conversation about our lived experiences during and after the earthquake. So participants included a geologist who worked with the international researchers, a journalist whose byline was worldwide, a CEO of an international media-oriented nonprofit who helped develop disaster-focused radio programs, a photo artist who gave national and international communities for disaster response, a student who was in the U.S. And who raised funds and worked online extensively to curate data and information, as well as a school teacher who worked in a rural community and a representative of nonprofit working in Nepal. So based on my narrative analysis, the narratives of these women illustrate how ecological literacies built through rhetorical agency help them, like they wrote, they researched, they communicated, they fundraised and conducted relief activities. They also designed community-based environmental risk communication for developing ecological literacies, and also they also did that by creating and mobilizing various assemblages across the globe. By assemblages, I mean creating transnational connections among people, and mediated through technologies where both human as well as non-human actors and elements such as phone, digital media, laptop are connected together. And by ecological literacies, I mean an awareness of the current situation where people are motivated, people are literate about what's happening in their lives and how earthquake has changed that. So, based on my research, I found that the rhetorical agency displayed by the participants varied as they worked nationally as well as globally, writing and researching and disseminating information as well as fundraising and organizing the work. The participants displayed their rhetorical agencies by mobilizing their own personal networks and also by using technological mediums to connect and collaborate with people around the globe. And this helped in the formation of various formal and informal assemblages as participants managed unprecedented risks in the post-earthquake Nepal. So the rhetorical agency displayed by the participants ranged from spontaneous actions such as posting pictures on social media, mobilizing volunteers to gather data, connecting and collaborating with researchers from around the world, and the participants expanded their territory of their own small assemblages by inviting people around the world. And they did that by creating awareness and also by inviting people to take their action. So their rhetorical agency kind of created what I call global synergy. And it's kind of like a what I call transcultural rhetoric. So Dr. Wheeling Ding argues that transcultural rhetoric examines the interactions and negotiation between localities and larger global processes, flows, and structures. The transnational women participants worked and to study the immediate impacts of the earthquake. They raised funds, they conducted relief and rescue activities without any governmental support or any organizational support, they did so by interacting as well as negotiating that within their own locality, which is Nepal, and also beyond. So subsequently, they became the focal point for many other assemblages or many other people who were responding to disaster in Nepal that helped Nepali communities to survive the earthquake. And the women's agency challenged the rhetoric of vulnerability and how women are categorized as vulnerable in Nepal. And these women supported and built the community resilience and forged partnerships that created the global synergy. So the next thing is women's strong ties to the environment and their roles in natural resource management make them powerful agents of change with knowledge and skills for building resilience to climate change, climate disaster, and supporting low emission and development. So to share their environmental risk awareness and ecological literacies, the participants use various communications technologies, including radio and social media. One of the participants helped create a radio program designed to involve community while curating knowledge and meeting the information needs of the people regarding environmental awareness. To launch this program, she sought help of potential international donor as well as her own official networks and the local community networks. So she shares one thing we wanted to do quite quickly is to establish a recognizable program that people knew. And I also got a couple of people to help design that program, as well as people who could help us quickly gauge the public in terms of their informational needs. So this radio program provided information to the people about possible environmental risks and hazards in the post-disaster situation. And they used storytelling as a medium of community participation. Community members participated in knowledge creation about environmental risk and ecological literacies around the post-disaster situation. And they mobilized for the recovery effort. So by addressing the changes, risks, and challenges, including health and other various challenges, in post-disaster situation, the program focused on the meeting information needs of the people by sharing their ecological literacies as well as environmental awareness. And such program, I believe, in the future could also be beneficial in sharing the knowledge about climate change literacies and post-disaster context in which community is involved in creating knowledge about understanding and managing risk put forth by climate change. So in conclusion, 5 years after the April 25th Nepal earthquake, writing and research concerning it mainly foregrounds the work of men in responding to the earthquake. And I have myself seeing that a lot of men being represented, their work being represented as being heroic. And in those spaces, women are less represented or not represented at all. Sanat, excuse me, Sana Sobrazed, in her article, The Neglect of Women's Capacities in Disaster Management in Iran, a qualitative study, argues that men's skill and capacities were preferred for handling the affairs of the affected community. However, my participants had a different story to tell about their agency and their literacy. This is why it is important for us to highlight Nepali women's role in managing post-disaster situation after the earthquake, and why it is important to include women in organizing to address the climate change. So by this presentation, I honor the role and rhetorical agency as well as ecological literacies of transnational women in Nepal, who were the focal point for various transnational networks and various organizations that address the disaster in Nepal. So the stories of women who have worked on small or large scale disaster relief efforts should be highlighted in the work of addressing climate change literacies and global rhetorics. So while the environmental risks are increasing with climate change, it is evident that different populations throughout the world will not be impacted in the same ways. So in that case, women can play a significant role in developing community resilience through their rhetorical agency. Thank you so much. I hope I was on time.
Yes, you
Yeah,
were
that
definitely.
was 13 minutes.
Thank you very much. And next is Dr. Zare.
I'm hopefully audible now. My presentation begins with a story, so we're just going to go into story world. So we see a widowed woman named Devamani sleeping in her cot. Her 11-year-old daughter is nearby. Her landlord and employer, a farmer, comes in, and we realize that once again, he is using his body as a weapon, and she is forced to have sex with him. The next morning, she goes off to plow the fields of this very same farmer. This is her daily job. And in the afternoon, she discusses her widowed friend who's going off to the highway. She is aware she's going to earn extra money by having sex with a truck driver. And she asks her hesitantly if she thinks about how Jesus asks her to have purity of heart. Her friend explains she feels God would not want her not to be able to eat, or to be able to afford to buy a bar of soap. Since the farmer's wages give them the same scant amount, she has no choice. By the time she finishes explaining, both she and her friend are wiping away tears. Sex work is defined as sinning, but poverty demands this work. Later, Devamani and her friends screw up their courage and request a very small raise, 4 rupees, from a group of the village's farmers, enough to buy just a bit more rice. The result is that the farmer and his friends arrange a social boycott. That means they cannot do the work in their own field, and when they go to the neighboring villages to ask for work, they are refused. So for a whole week, they suffer simply from asking for a wage increase. The next and final scene opens, and a few weeks have passed. Devamani is awakening and the church bell is ringing to show that someone has died. It turns out the farmer who employed her, the one who has raped her nightly for years, has committed suicide. Owing to his crop yield being poor, he's given up and he's drunk some pesticide. The media is descending onto the village to cover yet another farmer in India struggling to make the agricultural life prosper. The village begins to go into mourning. We watch as Devamani takes a happy bath, wears her good sari, and celebrates by going out of her way to try and get some beef. In the ending, she throws herself on her bed and she lets her arms and legs splay out, a feeling of relief at the death of her rapist. In the very last sentence, there's a hitting sound of the door opening and the farmer's son is making his way to her daughter's cot to begin the cycle of violence all over again with the next generation. Now, this story, this very sad story, of course. The reason the story is especially shocking, though, for M.M. Vinodini's audience is that, generally speaking, the farmer is ennobled as bringing us food, right? And farmer suicides have been a serious trend for decades. But here the main thing is that the farmer cannot be a noble person as he commits this act of violence, as he is indeed to her a rapist. So I've given you a flavor of one story by Vinodini, and I think you can probably sense the courage it takes to tell that story and the many, many times when Vinodini goes to publish a story, she's turned down for writing about things that, quote unquote, nobody wants to hear about. I want to encourage you all to look into my most recent article on her short stories, which is called The Hole Inside the Hole, Recent Telugu Dalit Women's Revolutionary Life Writing. And that can be found in the book New Feminisms in South Asian Literature and Social Media, which is in Newman Library. And this talk is not a recap of that article, which is a couple of years old, but instead, I've had the privilege of being able to get translated into English 2 of Vinodini's stories and then edit them after they were translated, and then place them alongside an interview that I did with her very recently, about a month ago. And that will be coming out in the special issue on Dalit women of the International Journal of Women's Studies. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, is some excerpts from an interview with Vinodini. And I want to thank my translator, Sai Sital, for helping me negotiate that process of making sure that I can have her words accurately here for you today. These are some pictures of the author. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her biography, of course, but before I do, she would want me to start with Jai Bhim, right? Long live Ambedkar, long live the spirit of his commitment to outlawing discrimination and getting rid of the caste system. B.R. Ambedkar is probably the most famous Indian man that most Americans have never heard of. Maybe that's changing, I hope it is. I'll just say very briefly, he's a man from a Shudra background. He is one of the architects of India's constitution, a contemporary of Gandhi. He studied at Columbia, and he outlawed discrimination in the Constitution. However, it is one thing to have laws and rules and constitutional measures on paper, and it's another thing in practice to make that happen when social attitudes haven't changed. And that remains the challenge, just as for Americans today, the challenge is to truly embrace people from all ethnic and cultural backgrounds. So I need to say a little bit of background. First of all, I want to say that some of my remarks are drawn from scholars like Suraj Yengde, who's at Harvard, and Dr. Lalit Kandare, who's at Pacific University in Oregon. But let me just give you some quick facts. So 20 million of India's 1.3 billion person population are Dalit people. The Dalit is a word that means oppressed, and it's the word, it's a political term, but it's embraced as meaning the crushed people historically. It is also the word that denotes the formerly dehumanizing word used, which is untouchable. It can include indigenous people, tribal people, and people in the Shudra caste, the lowest rung on the caste ladder. They often worked with substances that were considered polluting, like leather, like cleaning drains and sewers and toilets. They were sweepers, they were midwives, they were people who prepared bodies for death. This was a system related to farm or artisanal work, and it's basically a leftover of the feudal system, and it shows up differently in rural and urban contexts, but there is discrimination in both contexts. And as you saw, an example of that in that story in a rural context. How did I get involved with this? I'm gonna go ahead and stop with the slides now and just only have one slide at the end. So I will stop sharing for a moment. Yeah, so India has vibrant, powerful feminists doing amazing work. And that's what I have been studying since 2002. But I came to know that there was criticism of dominant caste feminists for not incorporating the voices of some of the women around them who were suffering. Many women, of course, across India and across all nations suffer intimate partner violence, but Dalit women frequently suffer both on their job and inside their home. And so they are of particular concern. They are speaking out more and more, and they are actually the most powerful women, you know, in their own economy. They are very strong. They not only do jobs, but they manage the household resources. And we can think about them as being simultaneously amazingly resourceful, but also quite victimized, I guess is the only way I can put it. In India, in the year 2019, there were 87 recorded rapes a day. And that's just a recorded number. With Dalit women, it would be, in any case, a much higher number, but also with all women, it would be a higher number, of course. Very low income Dalit women get raped every day, and anti-rape laws don't decrease the number of rapes, it seems. It seems that many men are doing this and doing this with impunity. And the judiciary is often of the same class and caste as the perpetrator and gets away with it, even if there's reporting and even if there is an arrest. But I want to back up from the legal part of this and just ask you all to think about what's going on here. What kind of psychological weaponry is this? What's trying to be proven? So for a landlord or farmer who owns the land that Dalit people work on, to control the household, they have to control the woman. And to assault the woman of the house, which you saw in the stories done to both mothers and daughters and grandmothers, you punish other male members of the household and you assumed control. So again, it's about power and control. So the person who's helped me see both the emerging self-assertion and speaking up of Dalit women and some of their realities and challenges, it is MM Vinodini, Mary Madhasu Vinodini, and she goes by her last name, Vinodini. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She's born in 1969 in Guntur, coastal Andhra Pradesh. Her grandfather is an agricultural laborer and he converted to Christianity. Her father was a teacher, and though her mom never went to school, he taught her to read the Bible. She attended a Telugu medium school and she was the fourth of 5 children, and the rest of her brothers and sisters were not able to finish their education. She has a doctorate, she's a professor, she's a writer, and she's made a name for herself in literature, in poetry, short stories, and in Telugu literary criticism. So now I want to turn to, in the few minutes I have left, I want to just read you some excerpts of our back and forth from the interview, because again, I find her words very, very meaningful, and it's hard sometimes to capture some of the things that people are saying in India if you only are just looking at the newspapers or something like that. So I feel very honored and privileged that she was able to make time for me. So I said to her, your writing creates a desire for change, a belief that the current situation is unacceptable. You basically speak truth to power. What reactions have you received? And she said, for almost all my stories, I had to face difficulties. Any story that questioned the functioning of a society always draws a certain amount of flack. Many attack my works and stories on these lines by saying, I'm a Christian. I'm from a Christian family and I don't know what I'm talking about. They demand to know why I write about the denigration of people I supposedly do not identify with. I do identify as a Christian, but what this translates into for the average person is that I'm solely a Dalit. My Christianity does not prevent my Dalitness from being the salient factor that is seen by others. And then I asked her a little bit about the switch to online classes, and I had heard about a very sad story of Aishwarya Reddy, who committed suicide. She was a young woman from Telangana, and she'd gotten a full scholarship to study mathematics at Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi. So that's far away, right? And she was unable to continue. She took her own life after she could not get a place in the dormitory or a reliable phone to do her work after the pandemic hit. I asked Vinodini, have you seen many similar problems as an instructor? She says, the core problem is that technology is not democratized. Oh, sure, it appears as if everyone's changed to online and high tech, but fundamentally, access is very limited. While most people in Dalit communities have some access to mobile phones, it's difficult to gain productive use of them. Not all families can afford access to the devices, and only a few members may have even partial access. For most, one phone is an achievement and a status symbol they can barely afford, which brings them recreation. So she kind of described like girls needing to go to their online Zoom classes and kind of coming across their brothers who maybe were doing a job on a construction site and then were just sort of watching a movie during their 15-minute break, and they can't get the phone from them to do their classes. She also explains that the parents do not want the girls to have the phones. They think the phones are a bad influence, such as having boys chat online or through social media with the girls, that it could lead to bad things for their future. They want to safeguard their sexuality. So girls' education is suffering simply because of their gender. I asked her, are there also social consequences to the move to online education? And she said, oh, definitely. When you're not in class, people realize you're absent and they therefore think, oh, she's poor. Or, your phone must have run out of data. You can't afford a good phone, and people look down on you. When you were at college, she says, at least college was a somewhat leveling environment. Maybe someone might make fun of your clothing, but at least everybody's there for the same goal. And now the backgrounds are very different, right? Someone might see your father who's drunk shouting at you, or they might see your mother getting ready to go to work. They might see that you have to go feed the chickens. And so it's much more revealing and, kind of outs people in terms of their socioeconomic status.
5 minutes.
Thank you. Then I talked to her a little bit about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I said, you know about the surge, the amount of protesting that's going on in the US, the Black Lives Matter activism. And I said, I know about the Black Panthers in the 1960s, also influencing a group of people to call themselves the Dalit Panthers. And I said, recently activism in India has gained momentum using hashtag Dalit Lives Matter. So what have you observed about the parallel between, Black Lives Matter and Dalit Lives Matter? And she said, from my perspective, after the recent incident of George Floyd's death, we've seen a lot of white people coming out on the roads in support of the Black community. They've opposed the police treatment and desired justice so that perpetrators will not be allowed to get away with his death. So that proves some level of sensitization is happening in American society. But you can't see a similar kind of reaction happening in the Indian scenario. The composition of Dalit Lives Matter is not the same. You do not see similar support across groups because there's a lot of people following religious texts that sanction superstition and this stratification. We don't even see 1% to 2% of the upper caste people protesting in this way. And more people in the tier above the Dalits also need to be involved. It's not enough for Dalits to protest atrocities. It's only once people who are educated come out in large numbers that we can see some more fundamental change. And finally, I mentioned Virginia Tech, and that many other schools in our nation are having diversity and inclusion offices. They're having programmings, they're having trainings, and we can think about the strengths and weaknesses of that. We can certainly critique that, but I did want to know whether she thought a similar proposal or a similar kind of set of workshops or trainings or kind of a freshman orientation, if you will, for students about caste in India how that would go over, whether that would be possible, if that would be a productive thing. And she said, it's a good idea. And this is my last point. It's a good idea. There's already some sensitization happening in terms of gender, so why not caste? She said, though, that unfortunately, oftentimes if there's a program, it's really more students who are already very aware of these issues because they hit close to home that turn up. We see very similar things, I know, in the US. And she says, all institutions in India should take this up, and ideally this would be a mandatory course. I want to close with the words of Suraj Yangde, the scholar I mentioned at the beginning, and he said, each civilization has buried, untouchable souls of their societies. What's most important, I feel, is that we join together in a struggle, in a united struggle to stop discrimination of every kind. And to that end, I just want to share one final screen with you, one final slide. So recommended podcasts, Black Lives Matter, Dalit Lives Matter, Muslim Lives Matter, Women's Lives Matter, Migrant Lives Matter. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zare. And now Dr. Samanta.
Give me 1 second while I pull up the PowerPoint. And Dr. Samantha, if you can just let me know next, and I'll go ahead and I think you're muted. Ask to unmute. Okay.
All right. Okay. I had some extra thoughts since I first sent you that title originally, Nina. So what I'm going to be talking about today and how I understood our panel meeting today was really so what I did was really an overview of the kind of work that I have done over the years. However, I think what connects me with Bonnie and Sweta earlier is that I do really focus on narratives. I focus on the voice of my participants. I focus on issues of agency. And I think that that is what, in this overview that I want to share with you, I think those are the themes that connect my original work, my first research project, which is doctoral and postdoctoral, on the goddess Kali. And then I will go on and make a connection with subsequent research that I've did, because even though it was so different, there really is a connection. Right. So next, Jungwon, can I get to the next slide, the Kali slide? Yeah.
Is everything working okay on the graphical end? I'm so sorry.
Oh, I can see the slides. So I guess everyone else can as well. I just am not technologically.
Jungwon, can you please just show one slide at a time? Right now you have, use slideshow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, press
Okay.
use
So sorry about it. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Better.
So that'll be the next one then. There you go. Thank you. So this is, currently this is a book under contract late in the day, given that I did the work a long time back for my dissertation and post-dissertation. And it is really narratives of religious experience. And again, connecting with voice and agency, I approach the stories I would hear of Bengalis, experiences of the goddess Kali. And these are actually remarkable stories, which I did not expect. This is based on field work that I did in Kolkata, in Eastern India. And people across a range of the middle class, roughly. So musicians, clerical workers, various people, even doctors, right, who shared with me their stories. And when I asked them to explain what does this scary looking goddess mean to you, because I had come in from an opus of Western scholarship that talked of this fearsome goddess with the severed head in her hands, of being a demon killer on the battlefield. And yet I knew growing up in Kolkata that she was seen and believed to be a tender and gentle and loving mother. So I went in to do this research saying, okay, how do you understand? What is this inner view that you have, which the West apparently does not seem to, propose, right? In the scholarship I had at hand at the time. So long story short is that here were people who were across the spectrum of the middle class, as I said, clerical workers, musicians, small businessmen, doctors, who shared in their narratives of religious experience, remarkable stories of, and I can only broadly call them miracles, right? So this has been a book that comes in from a very different perspective to other work on this goddess in the West. In the East, her scriptures go back 1500 years. In the West, it's roughly 50 years, but not feminist, not Freudian, but really looking at indigenous paradigms, philosophical ideas that were colloquially understood by my participants. And so these are narratives in different contexts related to gurus and blood sacrifice and so on, that the book now is really working on in relation to those indigenous paradigms. Okay, so having done this work next, for some time and written and published and all of that on it, I asked myself the question, why is there such a gap between a very powerful female deity and the status of women on the ground, right? So say, Bonnie's presentation touched on that. And I saw high rates of violence. I saw very low levels of literacy. And so my next project, which was kind of the end of the 1990s into the 2000s, I worked in a slum area in Kolkata, again, ethnographic research where I specifically focused on women and girls and their access to education. Again, in keeping with the previous presenters, I recorded their voices. So my most recent publications into 2017, 2018, I was taken aback to see how many said, oh, well, we don't seem to hear from Muslim women, even though here are the numbers, here are the statistics. So I presented all the statistics, but then what I also did was I presented the voices of those Muslim women who said that we want to get an education. And my work in a nutshell really looks at certainly economic reasons, economic constraints to getting an education, religious, cultural, various constraints. However, I also looked at those women who had achieved some level of education. So in other words, what constituted agency? What were the factors that actually made them achieve despite the tremendous constraints that they faced? So in a nutshell, as I said, right into 2020, there's a print version of that 2017 article that is coming out. But this is current news, despite a constitution that says all kids should be educated in India up to the age of 14. Laws in place, a recent law in 2009. I found that Muslim women particularly have the lowest literacy levels of all religious minorities in India. Next, Junwan. I have interrupted this with this slide because this is a book of my translation from Bengali literature, and it also involves voices. And I would find that there are female voices, female protagonists in really famous stories. I mean, some of these authors are Nobel Prize winning authors, right? So I started out looking at the remarkable stories on the supernatural, really continuing from my first work, supernatural in Bengali literature. And then I found the really interesting stories that had female protagonists in these stories of the supernatural. So somewhere between my research, I did this particular work, and this was published as an anthology, my translations from Bengali literature in 2012, right? And this interview was aired in October 2019 on this particular book. Next, Junwan. Here is a labor of love. Again, agency, voice, narrative. In this case, my long dead mother, whose story I never knew and I was never told. All I knew was she was a doctor. Somewhere in 2013, I saw a photograph of her sitting with 13 men, the only woman, a graduation photograph from Calcutta Medical College dated 1941. And the feminist in me asked the question, why is she sitting there with 13 men and why do I not know this story? So I spent 3 years along the ways researching my mother's life story, photographs, documents, like it says, medical school reports, historical scholarship on women in medicine in British India. And I will share this with you. I wept my eyes out as I researched this story, and I published her story in the journal Biography in 2016. And yes, it was a tribute to her, right? So yet again, I saw a woman who'd come from a poorer background who had the ambition, the chutzpah really to aspire to a medical education. And this was 1935 we're talking about, that she went to school. She graduated with high honors. She would die very young, and that has been a story in my life and my lesson. But I told her story and it was published in 2016. So yet again, a narrative and a story. Next slide, Juan. On the same theme, much more recently, ethnographic research, I spoke with students, Asian and Asian American, at community colleges in the vicinity, the New River Valley. And yet again, I published a particular paper on the stories of 9 Asian and Asian American women who were either immigrants or the daughters of immigrants. And that is a paper specifically that relates to what kind of constraints do poorer Asian American women face. There is not much literature in this country on them. There is, there is not much literature on the value of the community college, given that there's about 6% of, I think it was a huge number that was there in today's newspaper, huge number. They are Asian, they are poorer Asians. So I wanted to know who these Asians were and specifically what Asian American women faced. And what is remarkable is that I found similarities between the Muslim women, the destitute Muslim women I had spoken to in Kolkata, and while maybe not destitute in the United States, but these were definitely poorer women who are working several jobs, going to school, in some cases with children, but who aspired to, and again, they are stories of perseverance and achievement. So I have agency right up there in the title of that paper that was published in 2018, just so as we know. And okay, and finally, this, just one more, my last slide over here. This is a project, again, that speaks of a refugee community that is in Roanoke, that was relocated to the United States from southeastern Nepal in refugee camps as recently as 2008. So again, I spoke to these students. It was a project that I interviewed them over 2016 through into 2020. It's a paper that will be written once I have my book done, which is due next month, right? But again, there's a story of ethnic cleansing, that they moved in the early 90s into the camps. They were called the Forgotten People. And when I spoke with them, they spoke of their excellent education by the United Nations in the camps themselves. But as over nearly 15 plus years, it was a community falling apart with no hope and no future in the camps. They were relocated to the United States, among other countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and others. But about, I forget the number, it was a substantial number pre-Trump who were relocated to this country. Certainly they have legal status, some are now citizens, but again, in a nutshell, this looks at minority status, it looks at gender, education, their educational histories, their schooling in the refugee camps, as also the particular problems that they face by relocating to the United States, including cultural, religious issues, generational conflict, poverty, but also the opportunities that were offered in the community college. And just so as you know, many of them actually went into healthcare related programs and have taken up work in the hospital systems in the Roanoke area. But this is a paper that will be written hopefully shortly. So I just wanted to share, in other words, a really vast array of the kind of work that I did, and tying in with Bani and Sweta preceding me on giving voice, giving visibility to voices that are not heard, right? Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for an amazing sort of presentation, all of you. I learned a lot. I always do, and this is one way for me to actually learn more about your research. And I really appreciated the connections among all three of you, especially the idea of sort of finding voice through writing, right? And the sort of meaning and meaning making through the authors and the writers and the voices that you've highlighted. At this time, I would really appreciate and encourage people to either ask questions in the chat or actually in in person as well, for those who might be interested. So can we go around if you have any questions at the moment? Otherwise, I will also ask some questions, but I want to give opportunity to people who are in attendance.
Hello, so Doctors Baniya, Zare, and Samanta, thank you for the wonderful presentation and highlighting a topic that is often neglected, but at the same time looking at the knowledge produced and the agency produced within the margins. With regards to awareness in the Eurocentric and, if you will, US-centric discourse, and I'm not going to just say academia because it's just everything. What are some of the ways that each of us can individually do and practice to spread more awareness about, for example, the Dalit people? And what are some of the ways in which we can do this every day at a practical level, whereby it can help spread awareness about this issue in particular, that is not only just limited to the US, but absolutely transnational, as Dr. Baniya pointed out. Thank you so much.
You're muted.
Well, I want to start by saying that, yes, we live in the golden age of the podcast, as we all know. And honestly, some of those podcasts I mentioned are just wonderful ways to keep up with what's going on with Caste, both abroad and here. Specifically, Equality Labs, which is out of California, has a whole series called Caste in the US. And it's, you know, about the diasporic community and grappling with it on social media, at the workplace, not just Cisco, but other companies, of course, but the Cisco lawsuit being something well covered there. I'd also say, though, too, this would be a note for thinking about maybe people who have anything to do with the K through 12 education or parents. You know, I was surprised, maybe I shouldn't be surprised at all, but the only thing I've seen from a school district about Caste was one of those like 5th grade Scholastic magazine, let's talk about India, you know, features. And yes, they're always going to be very simplistic, but I was really offended because it basically was saying, you know, this is a situation of discrimination from birth, and the emphasis was on these people can do nothing about this completely arbitrary system with absolutely no parallel to US racism, which is so clear and so, you know, obvious. And so it was very, very frustrating to see that. And I, of course, did not get very far with the 5th grade teacher who just kept staring at me, but I tried. What about the two of you? What do you have to say?
Can I just jump in there? Jingwan, just in response to your question, caste is, you know, actually, and not all the way down. I'm in that second tier of caste, all right? So not Brahmins, but second tier, so fairly high up, right? Fairly high up. And this is something that we, no matter how educated our folks were, our families were, etc., that we grew up with, unfortunately. And I, you know, I mean, I have seen marriage, classifieds in India Abroad, which is a newspaper published out of New York City for the Indian diaspora over here. And you will see, as I checked, and I didn't do any statistical study on this, but I checked, and indeed, pretty much most of the classifieds do indeed state some kind of caste affiliation for the bride or groom that is wanted, right? It is a rare classified that says, in quotes, caste no bar, right? Caste no bar. So unfortunately, it is alive and well. I've grown up with, you know, essentially people overtly, covertly kind of making that discrimination. And, you know, it needs to be said that it's there in the Constitution. There is affirmative action in federal jobs. There is affirmative action at schools, educational institutions like engineering colleges. And, you know, just the one time, several years ago, that I had a meeting with graduate students at Virginia Tech, and I asked them the question, how many of you are among the lower castes? Not one raised their hand, right? They were, in other words, the privileged who have, you know, were able to come to the United States to study. So this is alive and well. On the plus side, right? On the plus side, there is the Indian Student Association at Virginia Tech, should you want to connect up with them. And they have been, I know recently with the laws that were discriminating against Muslims who have been citizens of India for a very long time by the Modi government. So we actually did have a meeting, various faculty spoke at that meeting, and it was done in solidarity with a country that is still believed to be secular and democratic. So that is, a connection should you want to make right here on campus, right? So, say.
Yeah, just to build on that, a couple months ago, a Dalit man in Nepal was murdered for um, trying to marry a woman from upper class, and he was beaten. And a lot of, like Dr. Zare said, a lot of um, a lot of Nepali women get raped. In past 3 years, there has been more than 3,300 rape cases in Nepal, and unfortunately, most of them are from Dalit caste. So a lot of Dalit girls and women are the major target of violence in Nepal, and it's like killing them, raping them, and a lot of them. And unfortunately, even caste system has been eradicated in Nepal. A lot of time it has not, and even though people pretend that they don't care, they do. And unfortunately and sadly, some of the people I know still do that. And I also belong to the second tier like you, and I never faced such discrimination because it was granted to me by my caste. But I know a lot of people in Nepal, people they don't want them to enter their house, like they don't want the lead person to rent out, or like there are a lot of discriminatory practices that happen still, even though it has been eradicated, and it just breaks my heart. And but in India, there is also Dalit Lives Matter movement ongoing, and there are a lot of um, writers, journalists, as well as people who are advocating for Dalit rights. And it's slowly changing, but not at the pace that politicians in Nepal promised. I
Can I
don't
just add to
continue.
that? To, to one, there is a film, I think it's a Newman, it's called Caste at Birth, right? And so, as Bani said, it is analogous to racism, but at least from a social science viewpoint, it is not racism as we understand it in the United States, but it's analogous because you are born into a particular caste, right? So the film is called Caste at Birth. There is also a film called Bandit Queen. If you are, there's a book on her life, um, and this was a Dalit woman, in fact, and this was through the 1980s, and it is a remarkable story. Very briefly, um, I'm just kind of zoning out right now, so I cannot remember her name. But the book is called Bandit Queen. There's also a film, a feature-length film called Bandit Queen.
Fulan Devi.
Phulan Devi, thank you, Bunny. Phulan Devi. And she was gang raped by upper caste men. And she signed up with a bandit boyfriend. The bandit boyfriend died. She took on the leadership of the bandits. So she went to the upper caste village. She lined up those upper caste men and she gunned them down. Right? And then, so there's agency for you. And then she took to the hills of central India with this bandit gang, and she had the reputation of a kind of female Robin Hood, right? The Indian government did all kinds of things trying to make peace. She gave them a run for their money, etc. Finally, they said amnesty and so on. This is a woman who would then go on, she was illiterate. She would go on to enter politics. And then she was assassinated, right? When she actually did succeed in getting to parliament, she was assassinated. So Phulan Devi, and then she appeared, by the way, while she was still alive, on the cover of Esquire magazine, that too. And the picture of her was absolutely like some kind of avenging angel, when in fact she was you're really nothing like that. I mean, she was a small, kind of an ordinary looking little woman, but that's how. But anyhow, those are stories those are true. And Caste at Birth is a documentary. And talking about discrimination, whether I'm second tier or not, I have, even in Roanoke at the temple over here, I have been reminded that I am not a Brahmin. I have been reminded in other contexts that I am not a Brahmin, and so right at the top, and more of the same, right? This is unfortunately really, really ground into a difference between one group of people and another group of people who are not equal.
Thank you so much for all your answers and resources. I again, once again, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Sweta, I can't resist adding that when I went on TikTok and looked up Dalit Lives Matter, it's only Nepalis who have Dalit Lives Matter things going because the Indian government banished TikTok. But it was like, oh, Nepal! It was really, really heartening. Suchitra, may I ask, when you were thinking about, or when you were telling us about the stories of miracles and Kali, and you mentioned that the people you were speaking with were middle class, I was just kind of curious, do you think you would have gotten very similar stories if the people you had been speaking with were from different strata?
What was interesting, Mani, because I didn't really set out to do this research on any kind of, socioeconomic kind of, that was not my point, right? I wanted to see what Bengalis really perceived, because there had been, really a perception of the goddess as martial, demon killing, and that, scary image that is there of Kali, right? And in myths, that is what she is. In mythology, that is what she is, right? But there was this, in 1975, there was this very lovely book, actually very short and little book, done by a scholar in religious studies, he's Canadian, and he traced the history, I think for the first time, of this particular goddess who went from demon killer through various, religious movements, the devotional movement, for example, the Bhakti movement in India, right? So 9th century, 11th century, as the Bhakti movement took off. And she kind of, morphed from that fierce image to this image of the gentle, tender, loving mother. And so there's a lot of lovely music, hymns and so on that, that praise her as the mother goddess, give me shelter. She's still fierce, but she is gentle. And so, my family always saw her that way. They were actually affiliated to her particular sectarian, thing. And so when I spoke to these people, and I couldn't choose my participants, just I had to go through a priest, and he would point me to, okay, go talk to so-and-so, go talk to so-and-so. I couldn't show up at their door, in other words, right? Or slap a questionnaire on them. And so, this is the range of folks that I got. And they were not all Brahmins, by the way. They were lower down that caste, as well as socioeconomic levels. They just shared their stories of her presence as a mother. This is how they explained that scary image to me. They experienced her as in a mother's compassion. Those were the story, different contexts of life, crises, a sick child, whatever, right? But the sum total was that it was a mother's compassion, and those were the stories they told me. And they were broadly miraculous stories. I was blown away. I didn't know what to do with them for a long, long time.
Are there any other questions? I think we have time for a couple more if people are interested. I actually have one because the ACE, along with Dr. Jennifer Sano-Franchini, did a project on oral histories, and I noticed that all of you sort of did interviews. And I was just curious as to your process of interviewing, and especially if you could give advice to students who are in the midst or beginning to sort of start their process of interviewing and people, and what you've sort of learned over the years.
Do you want anyone?
Sweta, you want to?
Okay, I can start. So for me, I mostly use narrative inquiry in my research, and I do have some questions that, because for IRB we need to have some questions, right? And
Yeah.
so for that reasons, I develop like some very simplistic questions about the um, interview. And when I reach out to them and when I try to interview them, I set up the ground saying that I am not interviewing you, but I just want to listen to your story. I'm the moderator of the interview, or in between, if I have questions, I might ask you, but this is the particular topic we are going to talk about, and I want to know your experiences. How did you experience for example, earthquake? How you experienced the earthquake? Like just to tell me the whole story. And it just begins with how they, a lot of my, all the, most of my interviews, both in Nepal and Puerto Rico, it begins with people's story of what they were doing during the earthquake, and then slowly builds up on their activism as well as how they use their technology. So kind of like I myself, I do not speak a lot when I interview or do conduct my narrative inquiry. I just, when they are like, sometimes they are stuck, and then I have to kind of like ask them some questions depending on how participants perceive. But mostly I just make it clear that it's kind of, I follow the semi-structured interview rather than structured one. So that's how I tend to do, kind of giving them platform, giving them agency to tell their own stories rather than having a set questions and saying like, hey, I want to know X, Y, Z. So that's just kind of, I feel like it limits my, there will be some questions obviously, but like I don't want me to just ask those specific questions. So and I also tell them we are making meaning together, and in the process I kind of tell my story as well, and then we talk about that in a most conversational manner. And a lot of times, because it's related with disaster, the situation, the stories are very uncomfortable, the stories are of loss, and then a lot of different emotions comes in, and I have myself cried a lot, and I know Dr. Zare and Dr. Samantha, you both might have done that, because it's just so unbearable to just think of yourself as a researcher sometimes and have that boundary. But I am a very sensitive and emotional person, so I just cry with the participants a lot. And that's also kind of within my process, just reciprocating whatever they are saying. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Bunny, do you want to? I can go last.
Wow, that was beautifully expressed. Yeah, I think I'll just echo just a few things you said, which was, you're right. One of the biggest dangers is to talk too much. Definitely hold back. I sometimes sort of gently paraphrase what they're saying just to affirm I've heard it. So that probably is a skill I learned in, kind of peer counseling, which I wouldn't have expected to use in this context, but I think it absolutely is part of it. It reassures folks. I guess the other thing I'd say is, oh, I had one more thing. Oh, with translation. So of course, be prepared when you're using a translator to go back and return to questions that you thought maybe got answered. And yes, they got answered, but maybe the person kind of went onto a tangent. But then of course, since it's translating, you're nodding and you're thinking maybe this is all going along according to script, but it won't be, just like any interaction. So yeah, just being unafraid to ask for a second encounter, a third meeting, a revision, or did I get this right? Sharing your answers with the people you interviewed, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. I also use translator when I mean, my translator was my own partner, but when I did interviews in Puerto Rico, and it was a little bit difficult process for me to just make sure that whatever they were saying was just not a tangent, but they were answering some they were pointing some like questions. And I also did send my work to all the participants, so that they could read it, and they would know that if I misrepresented them, they would, I expected them to reach back to me, but no one did. But that was also one of a part of my process.
I think for me, it was when we were in graduate school, we were told that your experience in the field is going to be a rite of passage for you. You will come out changed at the end of it. And I think that it was 100% correct, right? We were told, be humble. You are the learner over here. You don't know it all, you know? So when I went in there, I mean, there were so many days that I felt like a fool because I didn't have the questions. But my questions grew better and better as, they've, Bunny and Sweta have said, um, well, we have words for it. We call it semi-structured interviews. I had kind of a broad set of parameters of, for my inquiry, whether it was with the Kali work, and subsequently a broad parameter, which I kind of left open-ended, right? And I think what emerged out of it, increasingly more refined, I would say, was really a conversation. And it was not just me doing the asking. Often they would do the asking, just as you said, Sweta, right? There were times when I was deeply moved again, and why not, right? Um, and sometimes it would be over cups of tea. I know that with the Bengali and the Kali research, it would be over cups of tea and lots of sweets, and what's your family doing, and things like that, right? It's really a relationship, and which is why, at least I know that for my kind of work, it takes a fair amount of time to do this. So we were told, okay, not less than about 9 months or a year, ideally, for that anthropologist out in the field, right? Um, the other thing, that we were told is, did I just say this, is that you need to be humble. You are the learner in this encounter, if that's the right word, right? You are the person who's doing the learning. And if you're not humble, you're not going to be learning, right? So, and the last point I wanted to make, of many, is that when I did the Kali work, and I did the work with the Muslim women in Kolkata, right, on literacy. So effectively different projects. But I spoke in Bengali, for both. I spoke in Bengali, right, to the participants. And that is a different experience, in my view. It was a different experience because I think when you speak, or you share a language, there is a cultural sharing. And, I don't, I don't mean to say that there is an advantage or anything, but I felt a relationship that was established because we all spoke the same language, right? When I did the other work, so the one with the Asian American students over here, obviously I spoke in English because it was a diverse group of people. They were Korean, Vietnamese, and so on, right? So obviously I spoke in English. However, the connection I found was that across the board, it was really interesting. They saw me as an Asian woman, right? And they said, many of them said that we were inspired by you because you're an Asian woman and you're a professor at Tech, and so on and so forth. And the same, applied to the Bhutanese Nepali refugee students. Obviously, I don't speak Nepali, and I spoke in English with them, and their English was by and large much poorer than the Asian students who were at the previous work, right? Their English was much poorer, but I spoke in English with them. And there I saw that we connected again on the basis that we were from the same part of the world originally, South Asia, right? I am not Nepali, I am not Bhutanese, but that far away in the United States, that was the connection. And I think that it resulted in stories and conversations and cups of tea, right? that is, that established a particular kind of relationship. So in answer to your question, Nina, and depending on how short or long, the students are who are doing the interviews and so on, it can be really different depending on what you're researching, the context that you are researching, right? The language that you are speaking. I mean, Jungwon's research is really so much about language, right, Jungwon?
Yes, I'm going to just do a quick plug on my latest publication in ethnic and racial studies. It's called Possessive Investment in Honorary Whiteness, how Asian and, oh my goodness, I can't even remember. It's a long title, but
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
Oh, we can't hear you. Maybe you can say it again.
oh no, I'd stop talking.
Okay.
I know that I'm not showing my face, so there's no cues, and this is all being recorded, and I'm going to have to transcribe it. So it's really embarrassing, but I was going to just mute. And thank you so much.
Oh, could you just tell us a little bit more about honorary whiteness for a second?
Oh yes, it's precisely. Let me just go ahead and read the abstract. Oh my goodness. Okay, so it is considering the call for a global approach to analyzing race. I developed a study which develops a theoretical framework where the racially effective economy of language use by Korean and Korean Americans at a predominantly white university, how that constructs this idea of playing into the role of honorary whiteness, which maintains the United States triracial order. And I further discussed the implication of this with the consequence of it becoming a mechanism whereby it is a maintenance, serves a function of maintenance of a transnational racial order, maintaining that is. Yeah, that is yeah. And then Dr. Samantha's on my committee, so she's seen this project develop from absolutely nothing to something now. So, so yeah. Anyways,
He makes a really interesting point, because I mean, again, in my own personal experience, when I work with students who do not, say international students who do not speak English or who are not strong in English, right? This is a huge disadvantage. And I would, really realize this late in the day that I had an excellent education in English in India. And I would really realize the advantage of it when I came much later in life to the United States, right? That I had no problem reading, writing, speaking, communicating, etc. And it is a problem for international students who don't have that facility with English. But talking about honorary whiteness, Jingwan, I had a friend of many years, some years ago, we were having dinner. And I said, as a woman of color, I said that just in conversation, because really, yes, I am. And she said, oh, Suchitra, I never see you as a woman of color at all. Right. And to be honest with you, I was as shocked as I was frankly offended, because, her comment, and she meant well, I understand, but her comment wiped out my entire background, culture, history, language, everything else by making me white. So just illustrating what you were saying in much more complicated ways, Jungwon.
I don't know. I couldn't remember my own article title on the spot. So, but thank you so much for all the panelists, because that was very enlightening, and I learned. I'm taking away a lot from this.
Thank you. I guess we've gone a little bit over, and I just want to be cognizant of people's time. So once again, I really, really appreciate all of your hard work and sharing your research and sharing it with the VT community and beyond as well, and for actually launching our new InspirASIAN series. I'm really, really excited. So just to give you an update on next week, we will be featuring Stacey Ann Chin, who is a spoken word poet, who is Jamaican Chinese lesbian, and she is going to be amazing. So hopefully some of you can participate in that. And then next month, we're doing another InspirASIAN panel actually also featuring Jungwon. So I hope you can attend, as well as two other APIDA graduate students. So it's a graduate student panel sharing their research. And the other two will be Hannah Chan and also Annie Patrick. So we're really excited about this InspirASIAN panel to really feature just the work that all the VT people do, and not just faculty, but also graduate students and even undergraduate students. So I'm really, really happy and excited. And thank you for being the first. And I really, really appreciate all of your support. It means a lot to me. So thanks everybody. I hope you have a good evening.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna stop recording now.
Thank you.